Hello, Andrea Scott here, Dean of the Jab School of Business at CBU. Reaching out to check in on you. If you're like me, the last couple of weeks have been rough. I've had a lot of sad days, trying to process and make sense of what I'm seeing. It doesn't make sense. George Floyd's murder really has taken a toll on us as what it tells us about race relations in America. I think it's time to have a conversation. I plan to invite a few friends to create a panel. We want to talk about what we're seeing. I'm inviting you to come, to listen, to learn, maybe ask a question or two. This is an opportunity for God's people to step up, to stand up for what is right. So, next Wednesday, June 10th at 3 o'clock, we're going to set up a Zoom call. Invite you to come. Stay tuned for more details and keep praying. Thanks.
Really hoping that this is the start of something that continues, not a one and done thing, because y'all know that relationships take time and practice and forgiveness and trying again and all that stuff. And we want to be able to show what that looks like as a community of Christ followers. So with that, Dr. Davis Hayes, educate us.
Oh, gracious. Hello, all. I'm so glad that you all are here with us. It's such a blessing that this turnout shows that people on our campus and in our community are indeed invested. When we look at the historical context of race, it's really hard to give because it's 400 years old. And Dr. Scott was super clear that I only have a certain amount of time. So of course, I am not going to give a 400-year never so brief history of race in America. But I think that amongst all of the news stories that came out recently, of course, we have COVID and we have the George Floyd protest, something that you might have missed is that the very last Civil War pensioner died this past weekend. And that's significant. I was talking to a colleague about that. I saw that in the news. I didn't think about the significance of that until we talked. But all that to say, so many things that we see as far in the distant past, as so long past, is actually very close to us. So this woman's father fought in the Civil War, and she passed this past weekend. The Civil War ends, of course, it frees formerly enslaved people by the 13th Amendment. By the end of that war. And I think often we say, okay, then everything was all right, and that's not true. Then the US begins this long descent into segregation. It goes into a long descent into denying people voting rights, into denying people ability to live anywhere that they wanted to live through segregated housing, through being denied the ability to marry whomever they wanted to marry. And so when I began to think about this reality, I actually went into these very sort of landmark cases that were passed that began to give people rights. Because I think today you hear a lot of people say, oh, well, we've passed this moment. We all have rights. Everybody's equal. And of course, we all know that that's not true. African Americans got the right to vote in 1965. That was 55 years ago. They could marry outside of their race 2 years later. 3 years after that, the federal government passed a law that said that African Americans, as well as other minorities, could not be denied housing based on race. And the reason why I bring that up is that we have to start to look at those around us, not so much in time, but in generation. How many people do we know in our world who lived in a world where this was so very common, to not live with people who are different from you racially, people who expect for African Americans to not have political rights. And of course, things just don't end, in terms of a particular generation. And so you have long inheritances of a worldview, as well as a way that society works, that we have to be honest that because these things are not very far in the past, that we need to continue to be honest, that we're still inheritors of these really dark moments and recent inheritors, and that because the nation has never really done the work to bury those dark chapters, that we continue to live with those dark chapters. And so that is my brief nutshell um, sort of history lesson of sorts, but I think also hopefully something that we can all meditate on. If we've picked up this baton of racism, of segregation, of marginalized education, of very little political rights, what are we going to do with this baton in terms of shifting it and changing it and creating the equitable America that we all pray to live in? And I think a lot of us believe that we already live in, and in reality, we don't. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Part of me just wants to let that sink in a little bit. I really appreciated the language you gave around burying and the fact that we have not dealt with it. And so the ghosts haunt us, and it shows up in different ways in different experiences. So I want to transition, and I'll start off with a very quick, I mean, you know, there could be a million times where the pain of racist action against me, many experiences, but the one that I want to share about is probably one of the ones that was unexpectedly painful for me. I grew up, I come from Jamaica, but I grew up in Florida and went to a private Christian high school, private Christian elementary, junior high, and high school. And I became very good friends with a little girl in 5th grade. And she would often invite me over for sleepovers. Now in Jamaica, you don't go sleep at other people's houses. You sleep in your own house, okay? So the whole concept of sleeping over was, you know, just foreign. And my parents were like, why you need to go there? There's a bed here. Anyway, they would let me go. And so I spent many nights hanging out at her home. There was a family of 3 sisters, and often all the sisters could bring their friends to sleep over. But I always, even though the other girls had their friends in their rooms, I was always put to sleep in the guest room by myself. I didn't think anything of it because, well, I don't know what a sleepover is. It wasn't until I was in my late 20s, early 30s at a bridal shower for one of the sisters. And we were just chatting about old times, and I mentioned how I always slept in the guest room. People's eyes fell and it got quiet. And it dawned on me that I was treated very differently than any other friend that came over. The hard part was that my friend's mother would smile in my face, tell me how much she loved me, kiss my cheeks. And somehow she didn't trust me. I don't know the why. I don't know the why, but the sting of that still years later is tough. I had to decide then, was I now going to never trust another white person? Was I going to hold resentment for this woman and her upbringing, which probably led her to a lot of confusion? Because I think she really did like me, but she didn't know how to deal with Black folk. It was in that moment in my 30s that I embraced what I believe God has given me to be, which is a bridge. I have always, from the time we landed on in this country, coming from one of many to being one of few, or sometimes the only person of color in the room, or the only woman of color. And yes, it was painful. See, that little person understands. But the bottom line is, I made a decision to trust God more than people, and to trust God with people. It is a constant, I think, daily decision to keep trusting and believing and hoping. I'm an irrational optimist, so that kind of helps. But really trusting that the Lord is orchestrating my steps, and to figure out how to not let that pain inform how I move in a world where I will looks like, you know, continue to be one of few or the only. That is my experience and how I'm moving on from there. What about you, uh, Dr. McCrae?
Thank you. I just want to share that I grew up in California, and I think like many white people in California, grew up kind of believing that racism was something of the past, and that being colorblind was the solution, that we just love people, right? I became aware of racism because my dad's best friend in college is an African-American male, and my dad would often tell the story about how he was allowed to bring his friend home, but his parents always chose to be somewhere else when his friend came into the house. They would never be in the house with his best friend, and how painful that was for him. So my dad was a pastor, and he pastored a church that was primarily African-American. And when I was younger, we helped merge two churches, one that was primarily white and one that was primarily African-American. So had the opportunity to engage a lot in race dialogue, and again, felt myself to be, as the term is currently, woke, right? And I think it's an appropriate term to say woke, because waking up is, for some people, a sudden thing, and for other people, a very slow process, right? Takes a long time to wake up sometimes. And so as time went on, you know, my wife and I fostered some children who were African-American and experienced a whole new set of issues with that. And then I became the principal of a school that was 93% African-American. And it was at that point that I learned that white people will mistreat other white people who are primarily around African-American people by virtue of being around African-American people. It was a really interesting situation for me. And those experiences helped solidify my desire to do something, to be active about repairing race relations in our country and in our communities and in our churches. But I would say that my most recent experience was last year. I had the opportunity to attend a conference for Christian professors. And we had this wonderful speaker, an elderly gentleman, white gentleman, who's a historian at Lipscomb University. And he wrote a book called The Myths America Lives By, White Supremacy and the Other Stories We Tell Ourselves. And he just shared with us how racism really is systemic throughout our society. Reading that book was painful. It was painful for me personally. It was painful to check myself. But that's when I really began to realize that we have some serious issues that have been built into our structure that need to be addressed. And we can't just be colorblind. We have to be actively moving to dismantle some of these things that we just believe are true that are perhaps not true. So that's my experience there.
Mine is a little different. I am first generation Mexican American, raised in a highly agriculture area of Riverside County. And in my neighborhood, there was a very clear white and brown divide. There was white farm owners, white business owners, and brown workers. That was essentially who was in my community. And I remember one day after school, we would often go to this little convenience store that was very nearby as we walked home. And we would go there to buy snacks after school. It was customary. And it was also very common that men, after coming out of work, would also go into the same convenience store to buy some snacks and some drinks. And that day was no different. There was some men that were standing in line to buy some drinks that had just gotten out of picking some oranges, and we kids were in line. And one of the girls just started pointing and laughing and saying, "Oh, the dirty Mexicans are here. You stand next to him. I don't want to stand next to him." And they started laughing and saying names like Beaner, Ditch Digger, Wetback. And all of this was being said in front of me, and it just kind of stunned me as a child. And the message that was conveyed to that little girl was that to be Mexican was somehow to be dirty or less than or not worthy of respect from a child. And things later got more complicated because my community was later bused to a less integrated, more rural junior high school. And there the attacks continued and got physical. And as a child, I realized I was unable to intellectualize the racism. I was unable to really intellectualize what was happening. But I felt the weight of it. I felt the weight of the oppression And it translated into self-hatred, and it's this feeling of unworthiness that I carried with me, and still fight to this day. And as a child, so then I'll push forward to college. It wasn't until I went to college that I took a class on Chicano studies and on Black studies. And for the first time, I heard about the shared struggles of Chicanos in America. And I heard about the shared struggles of Blacks in America. And I heard about other marginalized groups. And this was for the first time I felt like there's this collective force. I learned that racism and discrimination and oppression was this feeling of this perpetual non-citizenship was not exclusively my burden, but rather a collective experience of brown and Black people in America. So it was in college that I learned that there are institutional systems that were created to maintain racial and social hierarchy in this country. And so then at that time is when I decided that unearthing the realities of racial injustice in America would be my life's work.
Go ahead, Nolan. Professor Gouveia, sorry.
Hi, everyone. I'm Professor Gouveia, and along with being a professor here at CBU, I also own a gym here in Riverside. And over the past week or so, I started seeing a lot of the Black members in my gym just super beaten up, super heartbroken. And so I started asking them, what's going on? What's happening? And they started really delving into just the history that I had no idea about. And so when Dr. McCrae talks about being woke, I guess I'm newly woke, because to me, I thought racism was dead. I thought everybody loved everybody and this is a happy world. But unfortunately, what I've learned is that's just my white privilege, and that's just the way that I've been able to see it. And so what I've been doing recently in the last 5-6 days has really just been diving in and just educating myself. Every one of my friends who knows a lot more about this, and people like Dr. Scott, a couple members from the Black community, pastors that I really look up to, gave me some recommendations. The documentary 13th on Netflix, that totally changed my life. I can say it changed my life. There's few things that I can say have changed my life. So 13th, I'm reading a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. I read, what is it? I'll get all the different things that I did and we'll send it out to you guys. But the big thing I've been doing is just going through YouTube and just checking out, and it's kind of like a rabbit trail of just one person says one thing, another person says another thing. But what I'm seeing is that there's deep hurt, and there's a deep need for a movement. There's deep need for specifically the white community to become woke and just to learn what's going on, learn the history of our brothers and sisters. And that's where I'm at right now. So I'm embarrassed for not knowing this as deeply as I do now, but I'm hoping to be a light in a place where more and more of the community that I normally am in can start to learn this as well.
Well, am I still muted? Dr. Hayes?
Yes. I thought I was up, but I didn't want to make any assumptions.
Yeah. No.
When you tasked me to answer this question, I thought it was an interesting one. as an African American woman in the US, because there's so many options, right? You go through huge chunks of your life having racialized experiences, some that you gloss over, some that you bury, and some that stick with you no matter what. They're with you and they're a part of the texture of your being. And so having to pick one, I picked one that I felt reflected something that we talk about so often now, and that's systemic racism, right? Not necessarily what happened with friends, which I've had those experiences, or at school when I've had those experiences. When it was time for me to go to graduate school at Purdue University, a good friend of mine, who's a white woman, decided to go road tripping. So I was in school in North Carolina, I was going to the PhD program, and we drove from North Carolina to Indiana, and that was actually a super crazy trip, but that's a whole different story. But you know, it's before the internet, so it's analog, and you get to a town and you get the local newspaper, right? And there's the job posting or the housing postings, and you start to call people, say, you know, hi, I'm in town, I'm looking for a place to live. And so we had a number of addresses to come and visit. And what we found in the first couple of houses, apartments, whatever, is that the people renting in the small town in Indiana, West Lafayette, Indiana, never looked me in the face. They looked at my friend. And we would tour, and at some point, she would have to double down and say, I'm not living here. I'm going back to North Carolina. She's living here. And it would be like, oh, well, we'll get back to you. At some point, I'm sure we'll have other people come to visit. And so that happened, it continued to happen. And then finally we got to an apartment, and my friend had to say once again to the landlord, I'm not living here. It was almost like I would be invisible. I would be speaking about my budget and why I'd come to town, and I was told, and she would say, no, no. And the landlord just basically said, you're not living here, to my friend. And she was like, not at all. And he said, well, then that's okay, isn't it? And we were showed the door. And the reason why I thought that story resonated for this moment for me was for one of two reasons. First of all, we talk about systemic racism, and this is a really good example. It is, you know, examples of it's difficult for African Americans to, let's just find housing. Do you have the money? Yes. Do you have the credit score? Yes. Do you have the education? Yes. This still does not guarantee that you're going to get housing. But then there was another very personal piece, is that I was raised by parents of a very certain particular age. And they were the type that if you raise a Black child, male or female, you do not leave the house without presenting yourself in a certain way. You're always nicely dressed. You are as well spoken as you could possibly be. It doesn't matter if you're going to rent an apartment or you're going to the Walgreens. You get dressed a certain way to go out into the world. You put on your full armor in order to scale back the possibility of overt racism and discrimination. And here I was, all dressed up in my little flats and my double string of pearls and my sweater set. I looked like I came straight from a country club. And I think sometimes I still do. And please note, this is an armor that I do not know how to drop necessarily, right? That's just socialization. And so for all of that, to look in the mirror, do I look like the type of person, quote unquote, that can rent an apartment in Indiana? Will the pearls save me? Will the sweater set save me? Will the little skirt save me? Maybe. And it was so extraordinarily clear in that moment. No. Because at the end of the day, you are an African American person in American society. And that those doors do not necessarily open for you just on those grounds. Period. Ultimately, I found an apartment. It was fine, but it took twice. We were getting nervous towards the end because we had to go back. Like, I might have to pitch a tent, live in my car. I don't know. School's
Yeah.
But it was an ordeal. And so that we hear these stories. Systemic racism is not a thing it is a thing, for lack of a better
Yeah,
phrase.
yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. I appreciate everybody being willing to share what can be difficult snippets into our lives. So what we're going to do now, we're going to transition and spend the rest of our time responding to the question via conversation. So I've asked each person to read or paraphrase questions that we got from you, and then to respond, and maybe there'll be one other responder, and they know that I have no, gong, but I promised them that I will move them along if we don't stay within our little window. So with that, Dr. Davis, Hayes, you're back up.
Oh, am I? I'm first.
Yeah. Yes.
Would you like to pose the question and then I will answer it, because I wrote down my response. Write down the answer.
Okay.
Or the
All
question.
right. Okay. So how do we promote reconciliation and not divisiveness, as so many do? What support systems exist to further those discussions to take or action or influence real change?
I read that question over and over and over again in the last few days, and at some point I had to give it to the Lord, because my honest answer was like, I don't know. But what I felt that the Lord put on my heart was like, where else do we hear the word reconciliation?
Right.
And that's in family counseling and marriage counseling, right? That you have family members that a wedge has been created, that trust has been lost. And if you care about the family structure, typically you go into counseling and you work to reconcile. And so I think that in terms of scaling back the divisiveness, particularly as Christians, we need to first be very, very honest that we are a broken family. And I think also be very, very honest that there are members of our Christian family and our American family that does not even live in the same house experientially as our white Christian brothers and sisters. And I really have been sort of meditating on that reality and thinking about conversations that I've been having with white friends and white members of my, multiracial church, and some of them being really honest, saying, "I'm not being ugly. I just didn't know." And these are highly educated people. I've read the articles, I've read the statistics, but I still seem to have missed it. I talked to you, I spent time with you, you seem fine, so I actually sort of wiped the slate clean. This is not a broad crisis. And so if we are going to be a family at CBU, a family in the church, like any family that is struggling and broken, we need to come together and tease out the reality of the harm and work actively to patch up our relationship again. Now, how do we do? Is that going to be hard? Yes. I don't know anybody who's gone through family counseling and it didn't hurt, right? There are tears, there are arguments, there are people who want to give up, there are people who never come back, right? And parts of the family continue to return, and others like, that's on you. I'm not a part of that. My mother was in counseling and psychology for years, so these are sorts of stories that she told. But in the long run, I think that what our strength is, talking about our CBU community, that we have the tools in terms of sitting down together and meditating on this American reality that we share, being honest of the hand that we have in that, and going through life for the first time together, not in a separate America, but in one America, one that is damaged and broken and bruised. And we have to put our back into it. And I'm sorry, there's going to be division along the way, but it can't be permanent. Any family that is working to be repaired has to get over those bumps to continue on. And I think, like I said, we're in a great space to do that. We have books galore, we have smart people galore, but we have to open up our hearts to do that and bring ourselves together.
Agreed, agreed. And and I want to encourage the other panelists to unmute their mics as they, because we still have like 2 minutes on this question if you're so compelled. But for me, what makes this conversation unique and why I get excited about this conversation is because the Holy Spirit is part of this, and He's the one who does the work in our hearts. We could talk for the rest of the day, and we can't convince anybody to check themselves. But when, as believers, we surrender to the prompting of the Spirit, no matter how hard it is, He actually helps us with those hard conversations, helps us with those hard decisions we have to make, to not laugh at those jokes, to not forward those emails, to say to the person who says something inappropriate or thinks something inappropriate, hey, that's not cool, with the realization that there is some personal risk there for rejection from a friend or from a grandpa or from a mom or a brother, where we're going to have to decide, who do we want to follow? Is it Jesus or not? And what price are we willing to pay? All right, we're going to keep going. We're doing well. We're doing well so far. We'll see. Okay, here we go. Professor Gouveia, how can student voices be heard and not feel threatened when they do? And how do we better equip ourselves for these conversations?
Perfect. Yeah. So any students listening, I speak for everyone at CBU, especially the faculty, when I say that we want to hear what you have to say. We don't lie to ourselves or to anyone else and say that we know everything. We want to listen to what's going on. We want to hear what's going on in your heart, and we want to wrestle with that with you. Just know that if you feel threatened in any way speaking up, please talk to a professor that you that you have become personal with, or that you've worked with in the past. And if you feel threatened to say anything, come find me, and I would love to hear what you have to say, and I would love to fight with you and for you, and I will help lead the way. So if you're feeling like there's something that needs to be said, I'd love to help you with that. Something, though, to keep in mind for all of us is that learning occurs when we listen rather than when we speak. Okay, so we want to listen a lot more than we're speaking if possible, and let's listen to everything happening around us, take it in, pray about it. That's been a big one for me lately. And then just try to see it through the lens of somebody else. I think that empathy needs to rise, and I think that we're on the track to make that happen, but I think that we can all do a better job. But to answer your question, I believe that CBU just employs some of the best faculty, some of the best people with the biggest hearts that I've ever seen. And we're here for you. So please come talk with us. Anytime, find us in our offices or email us or whatever, and we're here for you.
Okay. And I want to make sure that we understand, thank you for that, Professor Nolan. I want to make sure we understand that we're not just talking to students of color, okay?
Right.
All students sometimes feel threatened or scared or confused about how to talk about race relations, because it is a 40-year really messed up history. And they're like, well, I wasn't around in slavery. How come I have to, whatever? Bring that forward, to, like you said, it's not going to get worked through if you don't talk about it. Ask questions, educate yourself. I'm having to educate myself because when I walk in the store and get followed, nobody's like, oh, that's a Jamaican woman. They follow me because I'm a Black woman. So I had to educate myself on what it means to be Black in America. And yes, that still happens. PhD, BMW, it don't matter. Okay. So just trying to help you understand how it's okay to not know. But once you know, or once you've been exposed, it's not okay to stay in the same place. Any other things from the panelists before?
Can I say
Go
one
ahead,
more
please,
thing?
Nolan.
Because
of course, yeah.
I'm going to be leaving in 5 minutes, unfortunately, so I just wanted to get something out there. For those of you that are white, I would just recommend that you definitely start to educate yourself on just the history in general, because what I'm seeing when I speak with other, we'll just call them white people, the thing that they keep telling me is that it's not their fault that their parents or their grandparents or whatever did all of this. So why should I have to deal with it now? And why is it my fault in any way? And somewhat, I can see where they're coming from, but I would just challenge you to make sure that the bill stops with us, and that we change and that we move forward. We have a chance right now for this, to do something about it. And we're only going to be able to do something about it if we really educate ourselves. Because like I said, I didn't know as much as I do now, and it's because I didn't want to get uncomfortable, to be honest. So get a little uncomfortable, and I promise you this world is going to change.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We're so grateful to have you on board, sir. Yes, yes.
Thank you.
All right, we're gonna keep going. Oh, the next one's mine. What kind of diversity initiatives or programs does CBU offer students and staff? How will CBU School of Business pursue a future of racial reconciliation and unbiased, et cetera? We got a lot of questions asking about what the university is going to do in light of the situation that we're in now. I think that's an awesome question. And I was really pleased to see the president talk about a task force that's being formed to respond to those kind of questions, a way to hold the university accountable for the choices and decisions they make as far as how to make tenure processes even and fair. That's a challenge that a lot of places have. And so what can CBU do to avoid that? One of the things that I would encourage a university to do is to have more of these conversations and have different voices come and share their stories, and to be a place that is not afraid for the awkward conversations, to get better and better at letting the Holy Spirit lead the way in why and how CBU continues to be a very special place to be. It's going to be new territory in some ways. We don't necessarily have a chief diversity officer at this school. I think the task force is a step in the right direction. And you know, I don't know what administration plans to do, but but what I am encouraged by is I got full enthusiastic support for what we're doing now, and I think that's a good sign, because that would not naturally be the case in other places. And so no one checked on me to see what kind of questions I was going to be responding to, nothing like that. And again, these are the signals that I see that give me hope for what can happen at CBU. The amount of people on this call, I think the folks who will want to hear more about what we said and did are also signals. So the diversity initiatives, I say bring those questions forward after the call. Ask them what will be done, what steps are already in place that we may not yet know about. Quite frankly, COVID-19 kind of hijacked a lot of stuff that folks wanted to do, and it's going to make it look and feel a little different moving forward. But there's no reason to believe that we're not going to see a change with CBU. People here really love Jesus. There is, I also want to, you know, as we think about how can CBU look and feel different, I've been avoiding the phrase safe spaces, in the sense that sometimes it's not always feeling safe to have the hard conversations. But again, without over spiritualizing it, we cannot underestimate the power of the Holy Spirit to help us navigate this. I would encourage you to hold university accountable with the entities that they work with, to make sure that there's representation in the different organizations that we align ourselves with. Things like that, you know, simple things. I'm going to leave it there, you know, because what happens in the future of the business school will lie more in the faculty's hands than mine. And so I really do hope, and I see a lot of my faculty on here, so that gets me really, really encouraged, that they will be willing to say, I want to learn more. I want to reflect Christ more and more in this area. And I really hope that there's a big difference or continued progression, let's put it that way, in the School of Business. All right, I'm gonna leave that question there for now. You're up next, Dr. McRae.
Thank you. I'd like to echo what Dr. Davis Hayes said and just build on that. It's so important to think of our community as a family. And so the question that I'm addressing is, how do we respond to injustice, especially as Christians, and how do we better equip ourselves for these hard conversations? So when Dr. Davis Hayes said that we're a family, it just struck me that when you're family, when you're close friends, right, you know when someone's hurting. You know when someone's sad, and it doesn't matter that they've plastered a smile on their face. But when we're passing strangers in the hallway, we say, "Oh, good morning, how are you?" "Oh, I'm fine." And we accept, "Yes, good, you're fine." We move on. But when it's family, you walk by and you say, "Good morning, how are you?" And they say, "I'm fine." And you say, "It's not fine. You're not fine. Can we check in? Is it possible for us to have a conversation? Is this the right time to have a conversation?" So I think as being part of the family, one of the first things that we do in the face of injustice is that we open up ourselves to caring deeply about the people who are around us enough to ask the question, what's happening here? How can I help? What are some things that I need to know? I loved the second part of the question, especially as Christians, right? And so one of the things that is so important, and maybe it's just important to me because it's something that Jesus has been hammering on me for a long time, it's the concept of humility, right? Jesus was humble, and humble enough to listen and to care and to do things that other people might not be willing to do. It is very hard. It's very hard as a white person to hear about white privilege and white supremacy. It's hard because it feels like an attack. It feels like I'm supposed to be personally responsible. I'm supposed to apologize. I'm supposed to, I don't even know what to do. But I feel like I am somehow bad because I'm a white male and I know that I carry a bunch of privilege with me, right? So it is hard, but it's important to have the conversation and to be humble enough to believe that the experiences that we've had are the experiences of a white person in America, and that other people have different experiences and their experiences are true and real and it matters. And I was having a very hard conversation with a very good friend of mine this weekend who was very upset about Black Lives Matter and very anti everything that's happening right now, and saying, we don't have systemic racism in America, he said. And I said, I'm not going to ask you to believe that. I am going to ask you to care so deeply about the people around you that you're willing to stop and listen, and you're willing to hear what it is that they have to say, and you're willing to take the chance that they could be right and let that open up. That there's a possibility that you and I are wrong, that we maybe don't know the full truth. Maybe we don't know exactly what's happening, and maybe we could learn more. And I think that posture of humility, walking into conversations with a heart and a passion to love people, is what God is calling us to be deeply invested in the people around us and to hear them when they are sharing their hearts with us. So I think that's an important aspect of how we deal with injustice, is to open up ourselves to the possibility that there's more that we need to learn.
Great. Other panelists?
I'd like to recommend a book that I started to read actually just this week, called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And
Nolan, actually, that was the one he was trying to remember as well.
Nolan. Oh, was he? Okay, White Fragility. And one of the things that really marked me about this book was it addressed exactly what Dr. McRae was talking about, is this defensiveness posture of our white brothers and sisters when we explain that systemic racism exists. And she goes into a real historical analysis and in a psychological analysis that Western white Americans have been socialized into this rugged individualism. And racism is a group problem. It's a people problem. People of color tend to have very strong connections around these oppressive situations, around racism. And Anglo-Americans have been socialized to believe that whatever happens to you, it's an individual act, that there is no group act. Whereas if you're living in a brown community, you begin to realize that your individual experience is a shared experience. You walk into a room full of Black men and you ask, raise your hand if you've ever been pulled over by the cops for no reason. A good majority, if not 100% of them, will raise their hand. Racism is a group problem, and it's very difficult for a white Westerner to conceptualize that. And so she breaks that down really well, and I think it's very helpful in the discussion of don't feel guilt, feel conviction. Don't feel shame, feel conviction. Listen, and those are very different things.
Oh, I'm glad you brought up the distinction. I think that's an important distinction. And, you know, because of where I went to school and just, you know, the circles I move in, the vast majority of my closest friends are white women. Usually you hear, oh, Mom, my best friend's Black. Well, now it's the opposite for me, right? So I have been able to have some really hard conversations, and I hurt to see them in so much pain when the waking up happens, and they're like, what do I do with this? And, you know, to the extent that we can continue to provide resources and safe people or safer people to have conversations with. And I would not assume that every Black person wants to educate you. And that's why you've heard me saying over and over, educate yourself, okay? For some of us, it's traumatic to every time have to walk through why this hurts so much, you know?
And it's very vulnerable to have the response, to put yourself out there in a painful way, to possibly hear from someone that you love and care about that they don't care, or that they don't believe you, or that you're a one-off or an anomaly. That's very painful. And so often people of color just don't say anything.
Right. And similar to what Nolan had, Professor Gove had said earlier, just to put it out there, some of us, and I'll put myself out there, are willing to be that place. So if you are a white person and you have these thoughts running around in your head and you're wondering, is this racism? Is this a problem? Is this part of systemic oppression? And you don't want to go and ask your one Black friend to answer that question for you. There are places that you can go, and there are some of us who will look at you and very lovingly say, yes, that's racist. So let's talk about that and where that came from and why you think that way, and some other things that you could do or other resources that you could look at that would be helpful.
If I may, I am so moved by all of this. Just the encouragement to do the work, as you said. There's so many studies that in moments like this, that African Americans, on top of obvious grief, can feel a certain amount of fatigue, because there's just an avalanche of friends and coworkers who are like, hey, can we talk? I didn't know. Can you teach me? And that it can become, on top of grief, there is exhaustion. But I think that for those who are open to those conversations and who are open to maintaining the relationship, it is so necessary to make sure, as a white person, that when you're talking to people of color, that they feel a safe space, because it actually happens more often than not, if I'm honest, to be sort of shut down. And so if some people are wondering, like, my gosh, why did the Black people in my world never share this with me? There's a possibility that they may have shared in the past, and people overtly saying, well, nope, that didn't happen. It didn't happen. That doesn't happen in America. And people say that all the time. And so this is a moment that we really should be building bridges and educating, ourselves, and just really, if we're a family, this is a moment to dig in.
Yeah. So, Dr. Alexander, if you'll address the last question and wrap us up.
Sure.
We got here really quick. That
We
hour
did.
goes by quickly.
We did.
Yes.
So I
yes.
have the question, it says the narratives out there, are you asking us to pick a side? And I could only imagine, because it's just partial, it seems like a partial question, that they might be asking about whether Blue Lives Matter or if Black Lives Matter. And so I took it as if that's the question, so that's the question I chose to answer today. So the answer is no and yes. So no. Support for our police officers and the acknowledgement that Black lives have value are not mutually exclusive. To ask someone to choose between the two is a tactic of division.
Yes.
The rhetoric of us or them has caused some to think that we cannot both honor our law enforcement and also hold them accountable as public servants. So this divisive rhetoric has caused some to turn a deaf ear, really, to the cries of our Black, brown brothers and sisters. And it has allowed some to dismiss the real human response of compassion and empathy toward the human experience. So no, we do not have to choose between whose life matters more.
Right.
So in recent years, we have been publicly mourning the lives of the many men, women, and children that have been violently killed in the hands of both private citizens and public servants. And until very recently, with impunity of consequence, due in part because of the policies that are in place that are there to protect the aggressor. The cry of the Black community right now is that we acknowledge that the killing of Black men and women at the hands of those in authority are not anomalies. They are not isolated. They are not situational, and they should not be rationalized. They are collective. They are a collective experience in the Black community. The reality is, and the data supports, that Black men and brown men are criminalized at a much higher rate than any other male in America. There is this narrative, we're asking about narratives here. There's this narrative, a presumption of dangerousness and of guilt that follows many Black and brown persons in America. And as a result of that narrative, it is often deemed acceptable to be stopped, to be frisked, to be questioned for no reason, to be arrested, detained, and in some instances even killed with impunity. So now to the yes. I'm employing us, CBU community, the collective church, people of faith, people of influence, to pick the side of anti-racism, to say yes to anti-racism. Not just the narrative of anti-racist, but also to choose to participate in the very active work of being an anti-racist. It is not enough to just not be racist, right? We must, because this whole idea of being a non-racist or to be colorblind is really taking a non-position. And it's a fundamentally dismissive posture. Anti-racism work is active, and it requires us to speak and to seek perspective from those who do not look like us. It requires us to evaluate our policies and to consider how those policies may impact people of color. We must do this actively for the purpose of not perpetuating systemic racism in our own institutions. And my final words about this whole thing is that, this morning I was seeking God and I was praying and I was reading, and I decided to read in Genesis chapter 4. And it's the chapter where Cain kills his brother Abel. And God calls Cain over and says, "Hey, where's your brother?" And Cain says, very defensively, responds with, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? And God tells him, the blood of your brother cries out. The blood of your brother cries out. We are our brother's keeper. Let's respond to the cry. Dr. Scott.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Now, yes, I see the hands going up. Yes, thank you for that, Dr. Alexander. Wow. I really hope that this time has sometimes made you uncomfortable, made you hopeful, made you want to learn more. More than anything, my prayer is that you would seek the Lord first, even before you seek out a person. And really, and I'm talking to myself here, you know, as I get ready to move to a place where it's 2% white, 2% black in the state of Oregon. So I have to I'm talking to me too, is what I'm saying. So I'm gonna invite Ted to pray, and I will pray again after him, if you don't mind, Dr. McCrae. And we will seek the Lord together as we move forward as a community. We have hope. We have hope. And that hope can propel us to make wise choices that can model again what this can look like through the lives of believers. And we just don't know who else is coming to campus and what the next world changer will be. And that person, those people could be right here at CBU, which is really exciting. So Ted, if you'll dial, I'll hang up and we'll call it a day.
God, thank you. Thank you for this time that you've provided for us. And God, we are here because we are responding to your call to be your servants, to be your hand and feet, to go out and to serve others. And I pray that you would continue to teach us how to be in a posture of humility and how to be your servants who care deeply about what you care about, who hear the cries of our brother's blood and who work hard at the opportunity of reconciliation. And God, we just lift up this moment to you, these people to you who are here, and we lift up our community and our nation to you as well.
Mm-hmm. Our Lord God, what an awesome God you are. We marvel at your goodness, your provision. We think about the clothes on our back, the food that we've eaten today, so many things. We don't want to take anything for granted. We want to quickly say thank you. Lord, we're thankful for the freedom to gather like this without any harassment from the government or elsewhere, that we can come together as a community, as a family, as your children, to wrestle with this, the pain that's in front of us. Lord, we're grateful that you have chosen that heaven will reflect every tribe, tongue, and nation, that this is how you made us this way on purpose. It was not an accident. And so, Lord, in that reality, we want to live victoriously. We want to live purposefully. We want to live in ways that can truly bring you glory and can move forward the cause of doing justly, loving mercy, and walking humbly with you, Lord. That is our heart's cry.
Yes, Lord.
In this time, we lift up the leadership of CBU. We thank you for godly men and women who seek to honor you with their entire lives. Lord, as each of us wrestle with what we will do now that we know, now that we can no longer claim ignorance, God, may we have the courage,
Yes.
the courage to move forward in faith with hope, and most of all, with your power. We bless you. We bless you, Heavenly Father. We thank you, Jesus. And we love you, Lord, and we long to love you more. I pray these things believing in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming, y'all. All right. And let's keep these conversations going. All right. Have a wonderful
Thank you,
afternoon,
Dr.
everybody.
Scott.
Everyone.